Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Housing Inventory Count Survey Training. My name is Elizabeth Perez, and I am a Senior Program Manager here at All Chicago, and I will be presenting to you today. So before we begin, we wanted to have a few housekeeping rules in mind. Please note that all the lines have been muted during this presentation. I will have an opportunity for some questions throughout the presentation, so I'll be able to open up the lines. I do ask if everyone who has a question, if you can please raise your hand. If you are connected via the computer, please make sure that the mic is working. If not, you are always welcome to use the phone-in option to call in and ask your question. Additionally, there is a chat box function, so you are welcome to enter any of your questions in the chat box. And as I take a couple of minutes for questions, I'll also look at any questions submitted through the presentation and answer those. So for today's webinar, we have two main objectives. I want you to leave this webinar understanding what the Housing Inventory Count, aka HIC, process is and why we conduct it every year. I hope to also share with you what the HIC survey looks like this year and for you to be able to complete a HIC survey for each applicable program at your agency. I'll also share a couple of information about the upcoming point-in-time sheltered count information. And that information is for agencies that have an emergency shelter, transitional housing, interim housing, safe haven, or permanent housing with short-term support programs. If you do not have any of those programs, you are not required to attend the point-in-time sheltered count training. So on your screen, you'll see today's agenda. We will be covering a little bit about the HIC history and purpose, along with what the process looks like from right now until submission. Then I'll quickly cover each of the HIC survey sections. I'll identify a few common mistakes that we saw in 2018, and hopefully that will share some areas for your focus and to alleviate any mistakes for 2019. We'll share the due date and some helpful tips and resources. Now, before we dive in, let's review a few common terms and acronyms that I'll be using in today's presentation. The first one that we've already heard is the Housing Inventory Count. It is also referred to as a HIC. So it's the same thing. And it is a count of all the inventory in Chicago that is dedicated to serving individuals experiencing homelessness. The point-in-time count is also referred to as the PIT, and the PIT is the number of individuals experiencing homelessness on one given point in time. For January 2019, that day is January 24th. So we take a look at how many individuals are in a shelter program on the night of the count, but also permanent supportive housing programs and rapid rehousing programs. Take a look at all the individuals that are currently enrolled and in a unit on that same point in time. HUD, which is the U.S. Department of Housing Urban Development, is one of the largest funders here in Chicago for our homeless sector. We often use and reference to them as just HUD. And the Homeless Data Exchange System, which we nickname to HDX. That is HUD's online software in which All Chicago submits all the housing inventory count and point-in-time count information. If you are one of our HUD COC providers, or maybe you sign up for some listservs through the HUD Exchange website, sometimes you receive a couple of notifications about the upcoming HIC and PIT submission in HDX. So those submission dates and notifications from HUD are for the collaborative applicants nationwide. But as long as you meet the deadline that we establish locally for submission of your HIC information, you will be fine. The Chicago Program Models Chart is often referred as the PMC. Our own community has developed this program model chart, which defines core values that are integral to the homeless services programming. It outlines program descriptions as well as some expected outcomes and system outcomes. And finally, the continuum of care is shortened to the COC. It is a membership organization comprised of organizations and individuals who work to prevent and end homelessness. Now that we've reviewed a few common terms, let's begin to what the housing inventory count is. For those of you that may have attended the DFSS in-person point in time and HIC trainings, a lot of the information that we'll be covering today is the same. So if you also plan on attending, there are a couple upcoming trainings. So we'll be sharing this information in the in-person trainings as well. So the HIC is an annual count of all the beds and units available in the Chicago COC that are dedicated to those experiencing homelessness. This is a HUD requirement, which they make communities nationwide conduct a HIC and a PIT within the last 10 days in January. It does line up with at the same time of the point-in-time count, and the purpose is to really allow communities nationwide to create a snapshot of what the homelessness scenario looks like in these communities. The reason why we do it, other than it is a HUD requirement, it contributes to the annual homeless assessment report, which we nickname as AHAR. This is a HUD report given to Congress which provides nationwide estimates of homelessness, including information about the demographic characteristics of homeless people, service use patterns, and the capacity to house homeless persons. Our bed and unit inventory that you report out on in the HIC is also used to support the work of coordinated entry. For those of you who have seen the Chicago Dashboard to End Homelessness on our website, you may have seen that there is a number of open units in our community and also the number that is of individuals being matched to different providers. So we do utilize the information from our bed and inventory submissions in the HIC to help us really know what beds and units are available and what does our matching process look like. It also contributes to the COC application. For those providers that receive HUD COC funding, we do provide information about our HIC and PIT. We do discuss increases and decreases as far as whether we've lost beds and units due to, programs closing and so forth. So we always provide a very in-depth information in the COC application regarding what our trends are looking like here in Chicago. And finally, we do use a lot of the information from the HIC to inform our funding decisions. So we do take a look at what is our need and what is our current inventory to see what are our gaps and how much more additional housing resources are needed in our community in order to fill the need. All right, for many of you, you have done the housing inventory count for numerous years along with me, and a lot of the information covered today has not changed from the past. There is a couple of changes that we have done either in the HIC survey that HUD has required us to make those changes, or we have seen a couple of different things that we felt locally would help benefit inform our system. So one of them is regarding the HMIS participation. In previous years, HUD had 4 levels of HMIS participation. So we had that programs either had all their beds participating in HMIS. Another option would be that some beds were participating in HMIS. The third one is that there was no HMIS participation because that program was a DV program. And the last one was that Some programs do not participate in HMIS because it is not a funder requirement. This year, HUD has removed the some bed participation option. Therefore, for the HIC reporting, we will be splitting out your program into 2 different programs. Now, we have seen a couple of programs that have already taken the initiative to do this because they have found the need for reporting out that it is much more helpful to separate those beds in HMIS to only include what those funded beds and mandate the HMIS participate and not include the additional ones. So, for example, if you had a 20-bed program, but only 10 of them were required to participate in HMIS, you will see by this time next year that your program has been split into 2 different programs for HMIS. So, what happens then, we will take the other 10 and assign them to a different HMIS number. At the program level, you will continue to operate as normal. I'm sorry, there seems to be a couple of feedback there. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully that wasn't too distracting. So again, at the program level, you will continue to operate as you normally do. However, it will be listed differently in HMIS, and for the upcoming HIC in 2020, you'll see that separation. If all of your beds are participating in HMIS, you will not see any difference in that regards. Additionally, when coordinated entry was rolled out in 2017, we started to look at how we were making matches in our system. And what happened is that we started to develop the Chicago Dashboard to End Homelessness. And it was developed and it is shared publicly, and it is currently available for any viewing on our website. So what we started to see, and if you ever are interested to check that out, you would be able to see that there is an option where we will see the number of opened units in our community and the number of matches that are occurring. So we did see, because all this housing inventory count information feeds into the Chicago dashboard, we started to see that some programs, during the 2018 HIC reported their total number of beds available in their program. And at that point in time, they were operating at a much higher capacity. Now, this could have happened that maybe at that time they were working with a landlord and they were able to provide a unit at a much lower rent, and that therefore they were able to serve more clients. But that wasn't the case, throughout the year. So we started to really take into account that we wanted to understand at a provider level for your different programs, what is that number of funded beds and units versus the total number of inventory that you have available. So I'll go a little bit more into detail when we get to that section. So I do have a question. What if your program is not required to be an HMIS due to a funder, but every year you are made to complete a HIC for this program? That's a great question. So the reason why we require participation in the HIC is because it does take into account all of the inventory available to serving individuals experiencing homelessness, and not just those funded by HUD COC or the HUD McKinney-Vento. And the reason why is we really do want to have a very good understanding of all the available resources from the different funding resources, because we know that HUD HMD is not the only source of funding. We also see some units and beds available through the VA or the runaway homeless youth. We do ask for all of them to participate so that we can fully understand what is our availability here in Chicago. So we thank you for your participation in this. And again, it's always very helpful to think like, how does this contribute on a larger scale? Because all of the information that you are providing also feeds into the annual homeless assessment report. And it's that report that is given to Congress to look at the need and, how communities are addressing homelessness. Well, that's a great question. All right. So on your screen, you'll see what the 2019 process is. So you're at step number 1, you're at the HIC training. And if you have some colleagues who weren't able to attend the training, we are currently recording the webinar and will be posted to our website, so you are able to view that at a later time. As I mentioned earlier, All Chicago is also currently conducting HIC trainings. So if you do plan on attending an in-person training, we'll be there as well. So we welcome any attendance at those different meetings. Once we've done all the trainings, each program will be required to do a HIC submission. And we'll go into detail as far as the deadline. Once all the HIC submissions have been received, usually in February is when the All Chicago staff conduct a follow-up. So we'll be taking a look at all of your submissions along with taking a look if there's any discrepancies, any increases or decreases from 2018 to 2019, and maybe contacting you to ask you any additional questions. Finally, around March, HUD will open up the HDX and allow for some data entry. So All Chicago staff will enter all that information that you submit into the HDX system. We also import our HIC and PIT, because both of those two processes, although they're separate, they are very much intertwined, because we will take a look at the point in time count information submitted to the Department of Family and Support Services and look at our HIC information to ensure that it aligns. Okay. So, who needs to submit a HIC survey? So any program that has beds and units dedicated to serving homeless individuals and or families must submit a housing inventory. So that means that your program is verifying homeless status at the point of intake and that the majority of your clients are predominantly homeless. Now for my permanent housing programs, that means that your clients were homeless at the time of entry. And beds that are in institutional settings such as detox facilities, emergency rooms, jails, or treatment centers are not part of the HIC and they are not required to participate. So I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. If everyone could just take a minute to mute yourself in the event that you're not. Also checking, it might be some of my All Chicago staff that may be on, so hopefully that helped and I was able to mute. All right. So on your screen, you'll see a list of all the different HUD types that must be included in the HIC. So if you were an emergency shelter, a transitional housing, a safe haven, a joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, permanent housing provider and program, you must submit a housing inventory count. All right. So the big question is, when is the due date? So as I mentioned, there is a separate HIC survey for each program at your agency. So as you saw, we had quite a couple of programs that have to participate in the HIC. So if you have an emergency shelter, a transitional housing, and a permanent supportive housing program, you would be required to submit 3 different HICs. The HIC does contain information related to the point in time count on January 24th. So please make sure if your program is participating in the point in time count, the sheltered count, that you're just coordinating with the sheltered staff to ensure that you know what that count is and what that number is, so that way you're reporting out appropriately. And finally, each HIC survey must be submitted no later than 5 p.m. on Monday, January 28th. So we do know that all this fun data collection happens on January 24th, but I understand that you do have staff maybe that did the point in time count sheltered count, or maybe yourself also joined us for the unsheltered count between the hours of 10 o'clock at night until 3 in the morning. So we do understand that there might be some time that you need to recoup. So hopefully by Monday, you'll have a chance to log into Survey Gizmo and submit all that information. On your screen, you'll see the 2019 HIC Survey Sections. There are 12 sections in the HIC this year. Although that may seem like a lot of sections, I do assure you that each section is very short. The nice thing is, for the HIC survey, similar to last year, we have the ability to pre-populate information that was submitted in 2018. So therefore, you don't have to kind of go back through your files and try to find information that was submitted last year, or maybe, try to locate if, someone before you submitted the HIC, what that information was. All that information has been pre-populated into the HIC, so you'll be able to view that information. All the sections are relatively short. If there's no corrections that are needed, there's only maybe 2 to 3 questions at the most that you would have to respond to. Right. Section 1 is regarding the project information. So I am going to ask you about the agency name, who the primary contact is and the secondary contact, as well as the site address, funding sources, and your opening start date. Now, for the primary and secondary contact, I would encourage you to list out 2 separate individuals, just because at the time, last year we received a couple of HIC surveys that had the same individual listed as a primary and secondary contact. However, if you go on to bigger and better things, maybe win the lotto and leave your current position, we have no way of reaching out to someone. So it's very good for us to have a secondary contact that can answer any of our questions. Additionally, later on when we talk about an email confirmation, that email confirmation goes out to the primary contact. And we do encourage that whoever is completing the HIC survey list themselves as a primary contact. We've seen in a few years that individuals will indicate maybe their executive director as a primary contact, and when we reach out to them to ask them clarifying questions, they just redirect us to you. So it's really who is completing the HIC and would have this information readily available should be listed as the primary contact. And we'll get into the site address and funding sources in a few slides. But regarding the operating start date, so I am going to ask for individuals to think back and give me an estimated date if you don't know the official start date of when your program started to serve clients. So we have been asked by HUD to indicate when each program has officially started. And we do know that this is kind of before our time, since the HMIS system wasn't always housed at all Chicago. We've had to kind of take back and go through time, in a sense, to look at some information. So it's very helpful to hear from, the agency themselves as to when those dates are officially, just to ensure that we have the correct date listed for everyone. All right. So I'm going to take a quick pause. There are a couple of questions that came in. So one question is it mandatory now to enter all of our clients into HMIS, even if they are not funded by HUD? If so, this will take some time due to the number of residents in our units. Right, that's a great question. So I would like to clarify that we are not mandating anyone to participate in HMIS. If your funding source is not dictating that you have to participate in HMIS, you do not have to if your agency doesn't choose to. What we are simply doing, I think the question probably came up around the HMIS participation. So if last year, let's say you had 10 beds and 5 of them were only required by your funder to enter into HMIS, but the other 5 do not. And because we know that a lot of our programs have graded funding and, low on the ground, that program operates the same. It doesn't matter, what bed is funded by what. The client receives the same type of services. When you were reporting to us, you would indicate that only 5 of those beds are being reported out in HMIS and listing that information, but the other 5 were not. So just for our system, what we would do is just separate those 2 sources. So we would only have an HMIS ID number for those 5 and a different one for the other 5s. And the ones that do not participate in HMIS, it's really just kind of a shell, so to speak, because it just gives basic demographic about the agency and that program. So I'll know that, let's say, All Chicago had a program, there were 5 beds, and I would just list the individual, for example, Elizabeth, myself, as a contact person for that program. And it's not that I'm actually enrolling any clients into that program. It just helps us create a shell in HMIS to know that that program does exist. All right, so hopefully that answered your question. If not, feel free to submit an additional question for any clarifying information. I have another question that says, when and where does the survey become available? Great question. So in the handout part of the webinar, I do have a PDF version of the HIC survey. Now, I know it's very daunting. It is extremely long. And the reason why it's extremely long is because any possible question to any type of program is listed there. Because I do not provide the link to the survey at this point in time, that will come out on January 24th. So as simply just registering for the webinar, I do have your email address. So come January 24th, Thursday morning, I will be sending out an email and sharing that survey link with everybody. All right, so hopefully that answered your question. Then we have a separate, what if you took over a project from DFSS? Do we use their start date or the date that we officially took it over? Wow, that is a great question. If you took over a project and you happen to know when their start date is, feel free to provide that. If not, just provide the date that you took it over. I'm sure I'll have tons of follow-up questions for you as well. So we'll be able to connect on that. Great. And then we have another question. Are the domestic violence survivor shelters considered as a homeless shelter? So I think that really depends. There are a couple of domestic violence programs that are considered an emergency shelter. There are others that are considered transitional housing. So it really depends on if you have a program name in mind, what that would be considered. You can always feel free to shoot me an email, to know. As I continue to go through the HIC presentation, I can share a link that will help maybe address this question. All right. So those are all the questions as of now. So thank you for providing those. Those are really wonderful questions. Okay. So for project site information, so I have 4 options for all the different programs. So for each one of them, you'll see that there is an open space to provide a complete project address. So if you are a single site project-based location, we know that you have one main address. So please include that address and the zip code so that we can know where that's located. For some other project-based sites, maybe you have a couple of buildings, so it's a clustered multiple site. that you use. So we know that here in Chicago, there are a few agencies that maybe have bought out the buildings and they're kind of 3 in a row. So we would just list for you to indicate the main address that you use for that project base. For a lot of you are permanent supportive housing programs and you operate a tenant-based scattered site. So that means that many of your clients are in their own individual units and it's spread out throughout the city of Chicago. So for that, we ask, and you can choose which would best apply to you. So one, if you do happen to work with a landlord that houses a lot of your clients in one building, we would encourage you to use that building address. But we know for a lot of our programs, that's not the case. You may work with one landlord on the south side, another one on the north side, another one on the west side, and so forth. So you don't really have one main location that has a lot of your clients housed in that building. If that's the case for you, please please write the address of your admin office and include the zip code. And the last option is if you're a domestic violence program, we do not want to have your address. We do want to honor that and keep your address confidential. So if that applies to you, please just click on the domestic violence address confidential option, so that way we know that you're a DV program. On your screen, you'll see the various funding sources that support the different programming here in Chicago. All Chicago will be cross-referencing with the different funding sources just to ensure that we are reporting out accurately. But I do encourage you to reach out to the appropriate staff at your agency just to ensure that you're indicating the correct funding sources. We've seen in previous years that individuals indicate that they receive HUD-COC funding, but we know that they do not because they don't participate in kind of the NOFA process that we spearhead here at All Chicago. So we do encourage everyone to just take a minute and check in with your staff. And we also know that different programs also braid funding sources, to support one program. So please make sure that you indicate all those different funding sources for us. Now, similar to last year, and as I mentioned earlier, we do have the opportunity to pre-populate information from 2018 into the HIC survey. In order to do that, you must enter a username and a password. And what your username is the name of the project as we have you listed on a file here at All Chicago. And the password is the HMIS ID number. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, for programs that do not participate in HMIS, you'll still see that you have a project name and an HMIS ID number. And that's not because we have your client's information in the system. It's just that we've created that shell, which gives us the basic demographics about the program. So knowing who to contact for that program, what type of program it is, and so forth. So in the event that you don't know what the project name is that we have on file here at All Chicago, you'll be able to just go to these hyperlinks that will be available in the HIC survey and click on that, and it'll take you to the 2018 HIC submission chart, as you can see on your screen. And I've included the link as well, so you're able to go in there as of today and kind of just see. So in 2018, we had 285 different programs available to individuals experiencing homelessness. So the list is pretty long. But as you can see, we have the ability to filter, and you'll see that A Little Bit of Heaven has one program, but Safe Haven, they have more than 3, but for the screenshot, you can only see 3. And then you'll be able to see what the official username we have listed, so how we know your project name to be, and then the HMIS ID password. Because that login function is a little bit sensitive, sometimes, as you can see with a Safe Haven 1801 South Wabash, there's a hyphen, there's a dot. It is really sensitive. So what I would encourage individuals to do is just go into the HIC submission chart, copy that project name and paste it into the username box of Survey Gizmo, and then just type in the password. So I would copy Safe Haven 1801 South Wabash SRO, paste that into the username of Survey Gizmo, and then type in 167. All right, so I have a question regarding the address. So we have a program with 150 scattered site units. Are you saying use our administrative office and zip code? Yes, that's perfect. So we know that 150 scattered site units, you may not have one project or one building that you're working with the landlord that maybe has 100 of those units at that one address. So if that's the case and they're scattered throughout the city of Chicago, feel free to just use the admin address and zip code for that entry. All right. So because we know that there have been a couple of new programs that have come online since last year, we do have the ability, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the 2018 HIC submission chart, to just start and enter that information. So we have created what I like to call dummy usernames and passwords because it really is not tied to any specific program that is currently existing, or that we know of at least. For a lot of those new programs, because I work closely with the HMIS team, I know of a few of them that have come online and have been able to pre-populate the information based on information we have on file. But for others that do not, now is a great time to let me know that you've started a new program. So if you started a new emergency shelter program, your username would be new ES program, and the password would be that 1000 number. And that's it for section 1. Section 2 is regarding your project type information. So again, in 2018, all that information that you provided to us will show. So you'll be able to see in 2018 what that program was indicated as a Chicago program model type, and then also the HUD type. Because here in Chicago, locally, we have a few model names that are not known on a nationwide level to HUD. For example, interim housing. It is a very unique hybrid program that we have here in Chicago, but because HUD does not know of that type of programming, if I were to go and tell them that I have 10 different interim housing programs, they would be so confused. So therefore, we've indicated what we know you here locally in Chicago, and then what we would be classifying you to HUD. You would either be an emergency shelter, transitional housing, safe haven, or one of the permanent housing options. So if you have any questions about that, if you're seeing some information from 2018 that you're not 100% sure why you're marked as that, you can always feel free to give me a call. In the HIC PDF version, you will see the different types of definition that HUD has for, when they're talking about transitional housing or emergency shelter, what exactly do they mean? And you can always feel free to reach out to me as well. For section 3, the target population, you'll see what was reported out in 2018 as far as the target population. For a lot of programs, you will not have a target population because that doesn't mean that you have designed your program to say you're only going to serve single males at your program. A few agencies do have that a lot. It's just whoever happens to need the services are more than welcome. So if you do have a target population, be sure to indicate that as well. If all the information is the same as last year, you'll just say, yes, all this information is correct, and you'll proceed to the next section. If for some reason some information is incorrect, you'll be asked some additional questions to just let us know what those changes are. Section 4 is regarding your HIC beds. So we'll have your 2018 information show, but as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the sections that will have changed from last year. So you'll be sure to let me know what your total funded beds are available depending on the funding source, and then your overcapacity beds. So what's that total maximum number of beds available at your program? So sometimes we've heard this year for some programs is that they may be reporting out to their funder that they have only 30 beds. But last year in the HIC, they told me they had 40 because, they were at overcapacity and were providing services to an additional 10 clients. So that's how we got to the 40. So as you can see, we'll still be looking at the total beds. And your total beds are just going to be what your funded bed is and what your overcapacity bed is, and that would equal your total beds. So this has to be the number of actual beds available at your program on the night of the count. So if all the information is correct, I imagine there will be a couple of updates just because last year we didn't separate out between the funded and overcapacity. So for many of you, I may just have the overcapacity as your funded beds. So please make sure to look at this section and ensure that that information is correct. And if not, make sure you select no and provide the updated information that we would need. All right, as I was talking earlier, what is the difference between a funded and an overcapacity bed? So as I mentioned, all this HIC information that we're collecting from you, the All Chicago staff will be putting that and data entering that into the HMIS system. With the rollout of coordinated entry in 2017, we were able to use this information to help really look at a system level what is our current inventory as far as units available. And if you were to look at the dashboard today, you would see that on the dashboard we have 783 available units, but only 353 individuals have been matched. So we know that there are a couple of things to work out. We know that providers aren't just really having some open units available where people, they're not being housed. We know that providers are working very diligently to get individuals into that unit. So we just want to make sure that this number that we're reporting out is more closely related to the funded number of units that each program has at their programming. If you're not sure what that number is, please make sure to check in with the appropriate staff at your agency. That way we can ensure that we display your information correctly. Section 5 will only show for individuals that have an emergency shelter program type. So if that's not you, you will not even see this section. You'll just be taken to section number 6. But in the event that you do, you'll be asked to verify 3 questions. So again, that information will pre-populate from the last time in 2018. And in section 2 is when you'll be asked if you are considered an emergency shelter. So just make sure that you selected no if in the event that you are not. But if you did, you'll be asked what is the bed type, what is the bed and unit availability, and your overflow beds. So your bed type, we do have some programs here in Chicago that are an emergency shelter where all their beds are in a facility that the agency owns. Other programs, maybe they've partnered up with a church and they're able to put the beds and units in that facility. And there are very other few that work, with a funder, and they're able to provide a motel voucher for a family or an individual experiencing homelessness and can place them in a motel kind of unit as they provide services. For bed and unit availability, that is more geared to what seasons is this emergency shelter operating. There are a few communities nationwide that have some emergency shelters that operate maybe only during the winter months. Here in Chicago, I don't believe we have any, at least not the last time I checked. So I don't think that really applies to us. Regarding overflow beds, we know that many of you have contracted out with the Department of Family and Support Services, and in the event that it is an extremely cold winter on the night of the count, is that they may call upon you and say, we have 3 individuals, can you provide a place for them to stay that day? So we would just indicate what number of overflow beds you have occupied on the night of the count. All right, I have a new question. So I do hear that there is something going on with the sound. I'm breaking up and there is significant static. So I do apologize for that. Thank you for letting me know. I'm going to bring my computer a little bit closer and maybe move around. For those of you that have been to All Chicago, we are currently in the last final stages of construction, so we're kind of getting used to the new space. So hopefully that helps. If it does not, please let me know. All right, someone else says, sounds good here. So thank you, Sandra, for letting me know. Another question we have, if ours is a DV emergency shelter that is not funded by HUD, will it show up in Section 5? Yes, so if your program is considered an emergency shelter, you will be shown section number 5. So again, in Section 2, you'll have a question whether this program is an emergency shelter. So if you check off yes, you will see section number 5. So if you didn't, make sure to just revisit section 2 to make sure that you answered that question. Great. All right. For section number 6, we will be looking at what are your new beds and your under development beds. So because I only collect information on the HIC at this point in time, we know a couple of programs have increased their capacity. So perhaps you received new funding and you were able to increase the number of beds at your facility. So it could be a subset of the total number of beds that you reported in the earlier section. One thing I will note for those beds that you must indicate that they are already online and you're already placing individuals into those beds. For under development beds, these are beds that will be coming online somewhere between now and January of 2020. So some programs have already received their awards and they know that they will be increasing, but that funding just hasn't come through just yet. So maybe, you're waiting for something to happen, or that you're in the last final stages of that. If that is the case, you would just let me know how much you plan on increasing, because come this time next year, I will be following up with you just to make sure that that program did start and that you are fully on your way to being operationalized. Regarding section number 7 is your bed occupancy. So I always like to say that this is probably the most difficult section up to now. As you can see, each section has been very straightforward, but it's really simple. It just does require for you to check in and make sure what individuals were in that unit or in that bed on the night of January 24th. You are separating out those numbers by the different household types. So we have 3 different household types that I'll review in a bit that you're kind of breaking that out. If you have a family and there is a crib involved, because HUD does not recognize a crib as an official bed, what I like to do on the back end is really make an argument that we're starting to see a lot of families with young infants in our program. So I like to make the argument that a crib should be counted as a bed. However, please only count a crib in the event that an infant is occupying the crib on the night of the count. For my emergency shelters, interim housing, and transitional housing programs, we know that a lot of times the program may double up, small children to one bed. You can have 2 small children to one bed, maybe mom and the infant or, a small child is in one bed. So we just want to make sure if that is happening in your program to just indicate and let us know. Because what we'll see is that you're counting individuals. So you would tell me there are 11 individuals, but I only see 10 beds. So that would raise a question for us here at All Chicago. But if you complete that you had, mom and a child in one bed, and that way I know that it's not just a counting error, but it was really just to account for what is happening. For my programs that are permanent supportive housing, please indicate that all the children are in one bed. I know I started to see that last year, a couple of programs were indicating that small children were doubled up. So for those, because we know each family is in their own units and hopefully have their own beds, we tend to count all of them to one bed. So on your screen, you'll see a snapshot of what it looks like in Survey Gizmo. So as I mentioned, you have to separate out the number of occupied and open beds and base it on the different household types. So for households without children, those are our single adults. Households with at least 1 adult and 1 child would be our families, but this is 1 adult and 1 child under the age of 18. Now this is the language taken from HUD, so this is only for HUD reporting that we would use that classification. Households with only children are only for unaccompanied children under the age of 18. So I know what I've seen in a couple of years with the HIC is that some programs may list like mom and dad in this household with at least 1 adult, and then the 3 children in this third row. Please don't do that. Indicate mom, dad, and the 3 children, the total of 5 in here, because what I would read on my end is that you had 5 minor unaccompanied children in your program on that night. Now, you're basing these numbers off the total number that we've mentioned in a previous section. So, you would indicate how many were open or vacant. And here in the cribs section, we really want to pull out those cribs. So you would just complete the cribs that are occupied on the night of the count. For my emergency shelter, transitional housing, interim housing, permanent housing with short-term support, youth, interim housing and transitional housing, and safe haven, you'll see a question in there that asked, what is the number of individuals that are in your program on the night of the count? Now, for those of you participating in the point in time sheltered count, please make sure that that number that you're indicating here matches what you provided to DFSS in their fax transmittal sheets. For all my other programs, this would be the total number of people in your programs must match the number of beds that are occupied. So for my PSH projects, if you have 10 beds occupied, that means you have 10 people in your program. Now, if you did happen to have some vacancies, so you were not at full capacity, I'll ask you the number of beds that were available, and we'll be taking a look. We'll go a little bit further as to why we're asking that. If there were no vacancies, that would mean that you're at full capacity and you would be able to proceed to the next section. If you were not at full capacity, we're going to ask you the number of vacant beds that you had available, and then we're going to ask you whether those beds would have been for a household without children, a household with children, or households with only children. Because we know a lot of our programs, you could have housed any one of those different household types, but because they were open, you don't really have them set aside for a single or a family or so forth. So what we do at the back end here at All Chicago is I would do an extrapolation calculation based on the number of beds that were occupied and that household type to see, hypothetically speaking, the number of beds toward what type of household type would it go to. Section 8 is regarding your HMIS participation. So as I indicated earlier, we have the options of selecting whether you had all the beds participating in HMIS, if you're a DV program, or if this program does not participate. So you would verify that information, and if you have to make some corrections, additional questions will pop up. As I mentioned earlier, we did remove some of the beds option. So if this applies to you, please note that we'll be just separating it out. So we do ask that you only complete the one that we have listed on the HIC 2018 HIC submission, that you would utilize that HMIS name and project. And for the ones that are not participating in HMIS, just complete it as a new program. And as we go further along in the HIC survey, you'll have a chance to kind of provide some additional information for me. Section 9 is regarding dedicated beds. So we'll have that information pre-populating from 2018. So for the purpose of the HIC, we are only capturing 3 different types. So we're capturing chronic homelessness, veteran beds, and youth beds. Now, chronic homeless beds are only for permanent supportive housing programs, so we do ask that you take a note of that. Now, a dedicated bed is a much higher standard than just prioritizing. So we know here in Chicago, we are doing the chronic homeless prioritization for our permanent supportive housing programs. But for dedicated beds, we really are looking for that specific grant language and that commitment that you have given to your funder, and letting them know that those 10 beds will be set aside for an individual experiencing chronic homelessness. If that's not the case for you, you're not setting those beds aside, and it's not really looking at your clients enrolled at that specific time and saying, oh, all of them meet the chronic homeless status, so therefore my beds are dedicated. So it's not supposed to be a representation of what happens to be in your program on the night of the count, but it's really that you are having those beds set aside for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. Section 10 is regarding your HIC units. So similar to the beds, we'll be looking at what is that funded number of units, what's that overcapacity unit, and what's the total. So what is funded plus over equals your total. Similar to the bed section, I envision that there will be some edits just because for the purpose of this year's HIC, I did take all the total units and made them as a funded unit number. So please pay close attention to that section and to make sure that we're reporting out appropriately. So I always like to include a slide as to what do we mean when we're talking about a bed versus a unit. Each year I always have one provider that will reach out to me and say, well, I have 10 beds, but I don't have any units. And I know that is because many of us report out to the different funders in just terms of beds, so we're not really thinking about units. But for units, we're really looking at what is intended to be considered as a separate living quarter. So we know some programs like emergency shelters, they may have one large room and that's where all their beds lay. But other agencies may have rehabbed a house, so they may have 4 rooms. They may have, 2 people in one room, 2 people in another, 3 in another, and then 1 in that last one. So that would be considered 4 different units. So, I encourage you to take a look at what the layout is and the configuration at your program. If you are having some questions, I know sometimes with staff turnover, there's specific questions that come up because you're not quite sure how a specific number was provided. So we can always feel free to chat and talk about that. Section 11 is about your unit occupancy. So similar to the bed occupancy, you will let me know how many of those units were occupied and based on the different household types. If you're not at full capacity, additional questions will show. And again, we'll do the extrapolation here at All Chicago in the event that you do a combination of different household types to see what type of unit that could have been for. Section 12 is a new section, and it's really just informational. What we started to see in 2018 is that we noticed a couple of unique partnerships happening in our communities. So we had one provider who provided the units, and then another provider did the case management to those clients, but they served the same clients. And in some of those cases, both Project A and Project B provided me with the HIC. So over here at All Chicago, I was extremely happy to see that we were increasing in our beds and units, but then later discovered that it really wasn't the case. It was just, that one agency was doing the case management and another one was doing the unit. So if that's the case, if you have this unique partnership, please reach out to the agency that you're working with to ensure that only one HIC submission is made on your behalf. All Chicago will be cross-checking that. We did provide a couple of questions just to let us know if that's the case. If that's not the case for you, these questions in here are not required, so you can just ignore all of them and proceed and submit your HIC survey. We also have a question that's really just open-ended. If there's any additional information that you think it's helpful for us to know at All Chicago, please include that information. We know a couple of times, some programs have experienced bed bug issues, so they have taken beds and units offline, but they plan on bringing them back on once they've resolved the issue. So we would see a decrease, but we know that those beds are coming back online soon. So that type of information would be very helpful for us to know as well as any decreases in funding sources if you've had to close a program or significantly decrease because of that situation. Please let us know. All that information helps us to advocate for additional funding coming into Chicago. And those are all the sections. You will see all your responses, and it'll ask you to verify each of your responses just to make sure that you provided the right one. And if so, you hit submit and you see a thank you page. An email confirmation will be sent to the primary contact. Survey Gizmo, for myself here at All Chicago, any email that I get from Survey Gizmo tends to go into my spam junk folder. So I would just encourage you to check in and make sure, before contacting us if that's the case for you. In that email, you will receive a PDF of the HIC submission as well as proof that you did submit. All right. So I'll just take a quick moment to ask if there's any additional questions before we really go into the fun part of let me know what is the mistake here. So I'll just take a few minutes. If anyone has a question, you can feel free to raise your hand or submit it in the chat box. So Mary, I know you had your hand up. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, but I see that you're connected via the phone. So if you want to go ahead and just connect via phone, just to ensure that we'll be able to hear you. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in. If you're typing that in, continue to do so. I'll just go ahead. I know we're at 3 o'clock, so I'll go through these rather quickly just to kind of help, since I know I promised this would only be an hour long. So here on your screen, you'll see that in 2018, a program indicated they had 19 total beds, but when they got to their occupancy, they indicated they had 19 beds occupied and 2 were open. So obviously you see that 19 plus 2 equals 21, and that is not the same thing as what they've indicated as their total beds. So this would prompt a follow-up call from All Chicago to say, Is your total beds really 21 or is it 19? Okay. Next, after talking with the program, they told us, no, you're right, I only had 19 beds occupied. So they went ahead and addressed that. But then when we asked to how many people were in your program, they told us there were 15. So again, those two must match. So if you had 19 bed occupied, that means you had 19 individuals in those beds. But if you're reporting out 15 people, that either means you overcounted in your occupied beds or you undercounted to DFSS. All right. So then I have a program that indicated they had total number of units was 15, but they occupied 15 and they had 2 open units. So again, that equals to 17. But also for Survey Gizmo, if you leave any of these sections blank, with no numbers in there, it'll read it as an error and will not allow you to proceed to the next section. So just make sure that you type 0 to allow for that. Next, I have a program, a youth transitional housing, who indicated in their target population that they serve single males 18 years and over. Now, here in Chicago, when we talk about a youth, we define youth as 14 to 24. So although I'm pretty sure the program thought maybe they're serving young people ages 18 to 24, there is an option in the target population specifically for youth single male. So it would be that, anyone under the age of 24. So just make sure that those two align and that you're cross-checking the different sections to ensure that every area is correct. Again, we have a youth transitional housing program, but when they got to the dedicated bed sections, they indicated that they didn't have any youth dedicated beds. So, I think if you're considered a youth transitional housing, more than likely all of your beds are dedicated to serving young people. So just make sure that you're indicating that as well. We've had a couple of issues, individuals call me up and tell me, I'm not allowed to move forward. I don't know what's wrong. I did everything right. And the reason why sometimes I can see this happening is Survey Gizmo, whenever there's an error, there's a tiny red bar that appears at the top of your screen. And it's sometimes easily overlooked just because it's a very much smaller font size compared to the other questions that we're able to edit. And then next to the question, you'll see, what that error is. So, if you're seeing that, just make sure you're keeping an eye out for that. I know it is easily overlooked and happens to me many times. So just take a minute to review. If you still can't find it, you can always feel free to give us a call. All right. So due date, again, a separate HIC must be submitted for each of your applicable programs at your agency. We are having all our submissions done via Survey Gizmo. I will be emailing out that survey link starting on January 24th. There are questions in the HIC related to your PIT if you're participating or to the night of the count on January 24th. So make sure that you're looking at that information. And finally, we are hoping that everyone submits your HIC survey no later than 5 p.m. on Monday, January 28th. If we do not receive one from you, you will be receiving a call from All Chicago. We just want to make sure that we have all our programs accounted for. If your program did close, unfortunately, we also want to know about that. So you can always feel free to shoot me an email and just let us know that you won't be participating because unfortunately you had to close. So a couple of helpful tips. Review the HIC PDF. It always is helpful to see what questions are in there in the event that you have to talk to a different colleague at your agency. I always encourage individuals to have the information readily available so that way you can just enter it into Survey Gizmo and you don't have to really worry about anything else. Additionally, we do have the ability to save and return at a later point. So let's say even if you don't have all your information, you can always utilize that option. And again, here at All Chicago, our team continues to grow. I am available for questions. I also have a new member, Max Burns, and Julie McFalcon available for any questions. So you can always feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email. On your screen, you'll see the option to save and return later. So you'll see it's a really small gray bar at the top, and as you can see, the font is a little bit smaller compared to the title that we have here. So just make sure that you're looking for that. Once you click on that, this window will appear, and you'll supply an email address to send that individualized link. I always encourage people to not exit the survey until you are sure that you receive that link from Survey Gizmo. The reason is because here at All Chicago, we do not have the ability to resend that unique link once you have left. So unfortunately, if you do not receive that email and you close out of it, you'll have to restart the survey. All right, so you're here at the HIC webinar training. As I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded and will be posted for later viewing. We'll have additional resources posted to the All Chicago website. If you are an SSVF, GPD, and rapid rehousing provider, we'll be doing a recorded webinar and we'll be posting that onto our website as well. Oh, and I think I received some feedback that some webinars are not helpful, but this one was good. Well, thank you. We're glad that the webinar is helpful. What time will the rapid rehousing webinar be posted? So we are looking to have that posted first thing on the 18th, but we'll be sending out an email as well to let everyone know when to access that. All right, so I know everyone's been kind of providing their questions as we've been going through, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to submit them or raise your hand. Okay, as people are thinking about your questions, again, any HIC survey questions, our main contact is going to be Max Burns. And you can reach him at cocprograms@allchicago.org. On your screen, you'll see the phone number that you can reach him at. We do say that email is the best way to reach us here at All Chicago. As many of you know, we are out in meetings or out in the field. But if you were to send us an email, we'll be more than happy to respond and give you a call as well. For those of you participating in the point in time count, the HMIS team has also done shelter point trainings to complete that, so you can learn more about what is the HMIS role. And there are some links to take you to those trainings. So I received a question is, what is the time period for the HIC? So the time period is you're really looking at January 24th, what is that number for that night of the count? So it is just a snapshot of who is in your program on the night of the count, how many beds are being occupied. So it's a one-day time period, not throughout the year. All right. Great. So again, I cannot stress this enough. There are questions in the HIC related to January 24th, the point in time count. So just make sure that you are looking at that information. And please submit your HIC surveys no later than 5 p.m. on Monday, January 28th. So thank you everyone for attending. We do have a survey, so I will be typing in this link in the chat box. Here at All Chicago, we're always looking at what we can improve to fit the needs of our providers. We want to make sure that we're giving you the information in a very clear, concise manner. So please provide any feedback that you may have. We do this on a yearly basis, so we do take into account all your feedback to see how we can continue to improve these trainings for future HIC processes. But if there's no other questions, thank you for attending. I do appreciate everyone's questions and attending this webinar. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I hope to see everyone soon.